Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Invading the Past by Koerner. Chapter 1. Unstable Threshold. The lab was filled to overflowing with technology. Cables and bundles of wires crossed the floor in such quantity, an outside observer might have thought the lab infested with snakes. Holographic simulation displays were mounted inside projection cylinders along the walls where they could be viewed without taking up valuable floor space. The primary interface console stood near the center of the lab. It held up a number of glowing green computer screens. Some of the displays were mounted on adjustable swing arms to allow them to be repositioned as needed. A keyboard was directly under the main monitor, and additional control panels and alphanumeric keypads were situated under the smaller ones. Behind the interface console, the focal point of the entire lab was a teleportation chamber. Cables running from the wall connections, computer consoles, and the primary interface console all linked to the circular platform upon which the teleportation chamber was situated. A bright white light shone down through the chamber, while vertical plates of the focusing array floated around it in a manner similar to the lower parts of a wind chime. The lab door split diagonally, with the upper left portion sliding into a pocket within the wall to the left of the door, while the lower right door panel vanished into the wall on the opposite side of the door frame. Entering the lab was a scientist in a dark gray suit. The identification tag clipped to his lapel identified him as Colin Sterling. At 43 years of age, a few strays of gray had started to infiltrate the inky black of his hair. He was clean-shaven and everything about him was neat and organized. Held in his left hand was a data pad, looking like a sheet of glass. The data pad illuminated requested information on the microfilament display installed within the upper surface of the transparent device. Currently, he studied the energy output figures of the latest tests. For the last 3 years, Colin had been trying to create a stable gateway for matter teleportation. So far, he'd managed to teleport a number of objects, but because of the instability of the gateway, he'd accidentally put a few things in orbit. Colin didn't know where the houseplant he'd used for the first test had gone, assuming it hadn't simply been vaporized by the process. Colin approached the primary interface console and plugged the datapad into an appropriate size slot on the side. The information previously displayed on the pad was transmitted to one of the monitors. Typing a few commands into the keyboard, Colin brought up a graph showing the frequency of energy output, the line rising and falling in a graceful and perpetual wave. Adjusting a few controls, he changed the frequency, and the line flattened with few variations. The lab door opened again, and a second man entered. He wore a business suit of dark green pinstripe with white. The shoulders of the suit were stiff and squared off, as was the current style among the rich executives. A perfectly tailored suit, styled brown hair, manicured nails, and a phony smile were the key features of Travis Wellner, business executive and leader of the Zellen Corporation. "What progress have you made today?" Travis asked in an overly polite manner, his smile constant. I've decreased power fluctuation by 15%, Colin answered. He managed to keep the disdain from his voice and maintain the outward appearance of professional respect. Very good, Travis praised. How long until we're ready for human testing? I'd say we're still a ways from that, sir, Colin replied. The board of directors is wanting progress from this department, Travis reminded. He pretended to look at the information displayed on Colin's screens. Progress may not be fast, but it does happen, Colin reminded. True enough, Travis agreed. However, let's see if you can accomplish both progress and speed. The board will see this demonstration on Thursday. 2 days, Colin repeated in disbelief. I'm so glad you agree, Travis accepted. I'll see you and your completed project by Thursday. Travis departed from the room, leaving Colin to his arduous task. Colin shook his head as he stared at the closing doors where his superior had gone. He knew arguing with Travis would accomplish nothing once the corporate tyrant had made his decision. Talking about the issue only wasted the little time Colin had been given, so he didn't bother. Colin unclenched his hands at his side, tried to remain calm. He hated deadlines, as they forced him to focus on production quota and timetables, rather than on innovation and creativity. Previously, he'd been able to experiment and try new things, to find a better way to make something work. But with the timetable added, he'd have no choice but to make it function, regardless of efficiency. Corporate executives like Travis seemed to take perverse delight in hampering his creative vision. Seeing no alternative, Colin went back to his work. He made several more adjustments to the power flow. One altercation caused something unexpected. The ribbon display, the energy frequency suddenly rippled with great intensity, spiking towards both the top and bottom of the display screen. The light from inside the teleportation chamber intensified to nearly blinding levels, and the focusing array halted its rotation to lock in place. An audible crack of energy discharge sounded at the same instant the lab vanished around him. Colin found himself standing not on metal plates in his research lab, but upon the bare dirt of an ancient road. A distant whistle caught his attention, and he spun around to watch a metal construction moving down the length of a pair of metal rails. It looked to him like a primitive version of the hover train, except it was in contact with the ground, and instead of the Kelvian power battery at the very front, a horizontal cylinder surrounded by various moving metal parts of black metal sent huge plumes of smoke skyward. Where am I? He wondered aloud. Chapter 2. A Long Way Home. Colin took in every detail of his surrounding in an attempt to identify his location. The trees faded off into a blue-gray haze along the horizon, the canopy rising and falling like the ripples in a blanket because of the sloping hills of the underlying terrain. To his left, an imposing chain of mountains reached upward as if to pull down the clouds in the sky. None of it seemed familiar in comparison to the towering skyscrapers, crowded neon streets, and flying vehicles he knew so well. Since he couldn't identify anything familiar, he decided to follow the mechanical construction resembling a ground-based hover train. If it was some sort of transportation craft, it stood to reason some form of civilization would be its destination. Once he figured out his current location, he felt certain he'd be able to find his way back home. His lab would have all the information he needed to figure out what had gone wrong in order to prevent the glitch from happening again. But on the positive side, the teleportation effect had been successful in translating him to an entirely new location. The ground was rusty brown and dry. His shoes kicked up small clouds of dust with every step, and he wondered if this area were in the middle of a drought. The trees seemed to be doing well, their branches long and full of green leaves, but the ground was parched with sprigs of withered and brittle grass sticking up everywhere. He reached the twin rails of metal he'd seen the odd train utilizing and stopped a moment to examine the material. Beams of wood had been placed under the metal rails at intervals, and gravel filled in the gaps between the beams. The rails weren't singular pieces of metal, but individual lengths joined by primitive bolts. Bizarre, Colin muttered. It's of decent manufacture, but a very primitive technological level. Putting aside the rails from his thoughts, Colin looked up and easily found the black plumes of smoke the machine had churned out along its route. It was already a fair distance away, but it appeared to be holding position, giving him hope he wasn't too far from an outpost or town where he could find more modern transportation back to his lab. The sun was hot, and after an hour of walking, Colin was covered in sweat. The sharp gravel might have caused him blisters if not for the nanopolymer in his shoes. He only wished he could have done something about the heat. When he stopped at the train station, he looked over the town that lay beyond, in combination of shock and dismay. Old and warped boards of wood composed every building in sight. The streets were bare dirt, hardened by years of use. No flying vehicles were present in the sky. No holographic billboard decorated the sides of the buildings, and none of the population showed any sign of cybernetic augmentation. It was as if the entire time was hundreds of years behind the rest of the world in technology. Colin felt certain the town wouldn't have a satellite uplink station to either pinpoint his location or send a communication to his lab. He doubted they possessed a transport station. He couldn't understand how any city on the planet could be so far behind the times. The realization hit him as hard as the answer jumped to the forefront of his mind. The town, its people, and its technology was literally behind the times. His teleportation experiment hadn't changed his physical location, but his location in time. Colin had been transported into the past. Needing time to think, Colin sat down at the base of a tree, enjoying the respite from the heat the sheltering leaves offered. Getting transportation to his lab to analyze the experiment and find out what had gone wrong was no longer an option. Finding a way back to his time might not even be possible. His experiment had malfunctioned, and without knowing how or why, recreating the exact circumstances to send him home was unlikely. To make matters more complicated, he lacked any of the necessary technology to rebuild his lab. Recreating everything with current levels of technology might be possible, but it was a daunting task. Colin realized he had nothing else to do this time. He was stuck, so trying to rebuild his lab was his only option, no matter how impossible it seemed. For starters, he would need some form of money, as he thought the credit chip in his right hand wouldn't be accepted, as the reader required to access his bank account wouldn't be invented for another 200 years. Another object for the present was finding a place to stay, as the weather control towers weren't available in this time. He leaned his head back against the tree, feeling completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenge before him. A rhythmic changing of metal drew him out of his swirling thoughts. Getting up, he brushed off his pants and followed the sound of the noise to its source. He found a small wooden structure with a perimeter fence made from trimmed tree branches driven into the ground. A sign hung over the door with the words "Blacksmith" painted in dark letters. The shack was quiet, as all activity was taking place in the enclosed yard. Set away from the house so as not to cause it to burn down, a large coal-fueled fire was burning brightly. The ringing impacts he heard came from a piece of glowing plate held in a pair of tongs and being hammered against a solid block of metal. Colin watched the large man work with the metal plate, altering from heating it in the fire to hammering it. The metal was expertly shaped and formed. It gave Colin ideas. He lacked the skills necessary to do the metalwork himself, but with the man's help, combined with Colin's know-how of modern technology, the two of them might be able to craft some impressive things, and possibly a way for Colin to get home. Chapter 3. Crafting a Door. Colin realized the blacksmith wouldn't be willing to work for nothing, as the man had a living to earn. So before approaching him with his idea, Colin required something to offer in exchange for the man's services. Heading back into town, he found a job available in the stables. It provided lodging in the loft, so he accepted the job, keeping the horses' pens clean and well stocked with feed. It took nearly a month to save enough money to buy the parts he required. When he was ready, Colin rented a horse and cart to transport everything to the blacksmith shop. "Blacksmith," Colin began. The man paused his work to listen. "I require your services, but I have not the great wealth to pay you. However, I can offer you inventions to assist you in your trade as compensation for your efforts. Give me a moment to set this up. I will demonstrate." Colin began to unpack his cart and put together all the various pieces. A small coal-fired boiler was first, and Colin lit the coals to give them a chance to heat while he assembled the rest of the construct. He attached pipes, pressure gauges, valves, and a number of gears on skeletal frameworks of metal pipes. Wrapped around the gears was a strong chain, and the chain hung down from a horizontal arm at the top of the framework. A final component was a tall cylinder of solid metal twice the width of his arm. Because of its weight, Colin couldn't lift the cylinder directly into position. Instead, he placed it down a small anvil and lifted one end of the metal column up, resting it on the anvil. Heaving up the opposite end, Colin walked forward, pushing up on the cylinder until it was vertical, balancing on the edge of the anvil. Colin reached up and tied off the chain on the top of the column. When he activated the gears, they spun and drew up the slack, tightening the chain. When the heat and pressure were high enough in the boiler, according to the gauges he inspected, Colin opened the valves and engaged the gears to draw in and release the chain at the top of the framework. As the chain was retracted, the cylinder was raised, and when the chain was released, the cylinder dropped with a pounding impact upon the anvil. By adjusting the gearing mechanism, Colin controlled the speed of the system. "Tell me, blacksmith, how much work could you do if your arm never tired?" Colin asked. The blacksmith came over to examine the automated hammer. He took a piece of glowing metal in a pair of tongs and inserted it between the anvil and the hammering cylinder, allowing the machine Colin had built to pound the metal flat. To shape the piece he held, the blacksmith only had to turn it and adjust the angle at which it was struck. Stepping back, the blacksmith dropped the glowing metal into a bucket of water, causing the water to hiss and emit a cloud of vapor. "What do you want from me?" he asked Colin. "I have a list of things I need for building bigger and better machines," Colin explained, handing over a folded sheet of paper. The blacksmith opened the paper and examined the list of requested items. "Even with the hammer you made, wouldn't have the time to make these things," the blacksmith denied. "There's too many." Colin closed his eyes as if his hopes began to wither away. "However," the man continued, "if you wish to be my apprentice, you can learn the skills yourself and build the list on your own time." "It sounds good," Colin accepted gratefully and eagerly. He switched off the automatic hammer. The blacksmith scratched his beard. "What other ideas do you have?" The sweltering months of summer passed by, followed by the months of autumn and winter. The blacksmith, known now to Colin as Frederick Mueller, had wasted no time training Colin in the various skills of the blacksmith profession. Although he was a quick study, he frequently came back to Frederick with his own skills were insufficient for the required piece. Frederick had suggested that the townfolk might not be understanding when it came to Colin's inventions, and Colin had been forced to agree. Futuristic constructions might be seen as magical or unnatural. Neither Colin nor Frederick wanted to upset people, so they'd built a warehouse in the forest, where they worked on his projects and crafted the technology of the future as best they could with the resources of the current time period. The entire length of the northern wall was taken up by the black hulk of a train's steam engine. The train had derailed during a winter storm, and Colin had taken great care in collecting the broken parts and reassembling them in the warehouse for his project. Rather than turning wheels to move a train down a track, the engine was connected into a gearing system at the far end of the warehouse, and the machinery there was designed to change the mechanical energy of the train engine into electrical energy for Colin's transporter. Electricity sparked from a pair of connectors where uninsulated wires were joined together. Colin and Frederick stayed well away from the electrical systems where the machinery was active, because while they'd been successful in creating the wiring to conduct the energy, the insulation surrounding it, in order to keep people from being electrocuted, was still beyond their manufacturing capability. In the center of the warehouse, surrounded by a carpet of cables and pipes connected to the nearby machinery, a pair of 6-foot-high towers stood 3 feet apart from each other, similar to doorposts. Copper wires had been wrapped around the tires from the bottom to a silver sphere at the top. As the energy was transferred into the towers, arcs of electricity surged over them and crackled outward into the air from the spheres. "If I'm right, this should open a gateway to my time," Colin told Frederick. With a hopeful smile, he pulled the activation lever. Chapter 4. Opposing Objectives. The air between the copper-wrapped towers glowed faintly before it split down the center and pulled back to either side like a curtain. The edges of the threshold near the tower rippled and shifted, being either a part of one time frame or the other. "Do you remember how to shut down the equipment?" Colin asked. Frederick didn't answer. He just stared at the metal room and illuminated display screens visible through the glowing opening in the air. "Frederick?" Colin questioned to get his attention. "What?" the blacksmith inquired as his attention shifted back to Colin. His mind caught up with the conversation, and he answered, "The equipment? Oh, yes, I can shut it down." "Good," Colin accepted. He shook Frederick's hand. "Thanks for all your help. I'll signal when it's time to shut down." Taking a deep breath, Colin walked through the portal, crossing centuries with a single step. His lab was not as he remembered it, but full of activity unrelated to his research. One of the things he noted almost instantly was a large defense box powered down by the main door. Dozens of hulking machines crouched on the floor like mechanical gorillas. "Mr. Sterling?" A familiar voice spoke up from Colin's left. He turned to see Travis Wellner, the leader of the Zelen Corporation, walking towards him. "I'm surprised you survived your time in the past, let alone managed to get back." "I had some help from one of the locals," Colin answered, while still being confused about all the additional hardware moved into his lab. "What's going on around here?" "Ever since you disappeared, we've been working on discovering what happened," Travis explained. He handed Colin a datapad. "Here are our findings about what caused your malfunction. During our investigation, we learned you stumbled onto a form of time travel and decided to make use of it." "How?" Colin asked. "Simple," Travis responded. "We're going to invade and take it over. No one in the past could counter our advanced technology. We'll conquer the entire world in mere days and rule forever." "What of the people who don't want to be conquered?" Colin inquired. "In the past," Travis dismissed casually, "they died long ago. What difference does it make on exactly when?" Colin nodded approvingly while pretending to look over the information displayed on the datapad, but his mind was racing, trying to find a way to prevent what was about to happen. He began to pace his lab, pausing near the portal. When he read on the datapad he'd been given the corporation, he hadn't figured out how to make a stable gateway to support the number of troops and supplies they wanted to send. Realizing what he had to do, Colin dived through the portal with a shout to Frederick. "Shut it down!" Frederick shoved a trio of levers up and the power disconnected. The gateway snapped close with a clasp of artificial thunder. "What's wrong?" Frederick asked urgently. "They're going to invade and kill anyone who resists," Colin explained. "They haven't figured out how to stabilize the time travel threshold yet, so we have time." "Time for what?" Frederick questioned. "We're going to build new defenses," Colin told him with a smile. "Let's get to work." 4 months, 1 week, and 2 days later, Colin and Frederick waited an open field outside of town. They wore goggles and breathing masks, protecting against the smoke being churned out by the various machines Colin had devised and put together with Frederick's help. "Are you sure this is the place?" Frederick queried. "Yes," Colin confirmed. "The temporal readings from my scanner have been growing stronger as the time barrier gets closer to being breached. This is where they'll come through." No sooner had he finished speaking, a 50-foot wide section of air was ripped apart, opening a passage between different points in time. The android ranks of the corporation security force stood in evenly spaced ranks and columns while awaiting orders. One combat drone stepped across the threshold and into the past as a test of the portal's stability. Colin, wearing a mechanical suit he'd constructed, moved forward to meet the drone. Pulling back on a set of rings inside the glove encasing his entire left hand, he applied tension to connected cables, causing sharp metal fingers extending straight out from his glove to close like scissor blades. Although unable to cut through the tough exterior armor of the droid, the powerful claw did secure a tight grip, holding the mechanical man motionless while Colin brought his main weapon to bear. Swinging his right hand, Colin jammed the large sphere mounted at the end of his glove against the chest plate of the droid. Visible through half a dozen holes in the sphere, were coils of copper wire. When Colin pulled the interior trigger, the coils of wire were charged with current, sending forth a wave of magnetic energy to shatter the upper half of the droid in hundreds of fragments and thrown them away in an equal number of directions. Only the magnets around the forearm, sending out a counting wave, prevented his own suit from being destroyed in the pulse. The destruction of the droid scout seemed to be the signal to attack. The combat droids of the future charged through the portal while the defenders Colin had trained and equipped stood ready to meet them in battle. Chapter 5. Confrontation. The pounding steps of the mechanical army were softened as they crossed between times and left behind the metal flooring of the staging area and entered the grass-covered plains where the conflict was being fought. The droids were fast and agile, their movements smooth, powerful, and precise. Despite their size, they dodged and weaved between the combatants with the skill of a dancer. Laser weapons rose out of concealed pockets in their upper forearms and hit every target they fired upon with pinpoint accuracy, cutting through metal, leather, and flesh with beams of cyan-colored light. Colin lifted the remains of the shattered droid he had been gripping in his claw hand, using it for a shield, the reinforced ally of the droid blocking most of the incoming fire. The first ranks of the defenders were not as fortunate and were cut into pieces in seconds by the initial attack wave. As the casualties increased, Colin quickly found himself alone on the front lines, with greater and greater numbers of enemies focusing on him. Hooking a flat lever on his left arm, with a specially designed hook on the underside of his right arm, Colin opened a valve to increase pressure to the leg pistons of his armor. In a jump punctuated by an enveloping cloud of white vapor, Colin launched himself from the ground and took to the skies. He came down closer to his own forces, landing on a droid with his claws extended to sever the machine's head from its body. Sparks and hydraulic fuel spilled from the broken machine as it collapsed. "Frederick!" Colin shouted as he closed the valve on his armor. "Fire the artillery!" From behind the armored rank of the townfolk, Colin and Frederick had recruited to defend their homeland. A series of steam bursts launched white clouds into the sky as pressure cannons fired in sequence. Red sticks landed among the combat droids, but the robots had never seen dynamite before and didn't know it was a threat until the fuses burned down and detonated. Pieces of flaming debris showered the battlefield on smoking trails. The fight suddenly stopped when the defenders realized no more droids had come through the portal. Colin looked through the open gateway into the future and saw many ranks of robotic warriors still waiting to be deployed, but none of them were moving. Standing at the front of the mechanical formation was a human, Travis Wellner. The head of the Zelen Corporation watched calmly, his face an unreadable mask. Turning around, Travis calmly clasped his hands behind his back as he walked away. A nod of his head to someone outside Colin's visual range caused the portal to deactivate and snap closed. Rousing cheers rose from the defenders as the battle appeared to be won. Colin remained cautiously reserved. "Why aren't you celebrating?" Frederick asked. "We've driven back as army and won the day." "This wasn't an army," Colin denied, as he pulled loose from his armor. "It was only a private security force, and the total numbers were limited as they still needed some to defend their holdings in the future." Other corporations have android defense forces of their own and wouldn't hesitate to strike at them should they appear vulnerable. Another reason for the attack not being at full strength is because they weren't expecting such heavy resistance. "Do you know how many people we lost in this fight?" Frederick questioned. "If it weren't full power, how can we possibly stop an actual army?" "I have a plan," Colin admitted. "Since they will need to build and deploy their own military, we have time to prepare our defenses." "I don't think defenses are going to do it," Frederick denied. "Their forces were too powerful as it is, and if they sent in an actual army, we won't stand a chance." "They do hold advantages in that they don't have to invent anything," Colin agreed. "They already have manufacturing facilities in place and ready to begin production. Also, they have the ability to attack whenever and wherever they choose. If they invade in a different part of the world, they will meet little to no resistance, and it will be much harder to dislodge them once they've established a foothold." "Oh, you're full of good news," Frederick grumbled. "As I said, I do have a plan," Colin reminded, lifting his goggles and resting them on his forehead. "As long as the corporation is intact, they will continue to send forces here to invade. So the most logical conclusion would be to take them down." "Are you suggesting we invade their time?" Frederick queried. "I don't think they'll be expecting it," Colin confirmed. "Also, any damage done to their manufacturing abilities in the future would slow their attacks here." "If they have defenses to hold off strike forces from other companies similar to the ones we faced, their headquarters has to be heavily guarded," Frederick pointed out. "Breaking past their lines will be incredibly difficult. Do you have some innovation to assist in this?" "I do," Colin said with a knowing smile. "Something we can use to our advantage. In the divided and antagonistic society of the future where I come from, rival companies hate each other and will openly attack and destroy competitors if the situation presents an opportunity to do so. If we damage their ability to protect themselves and their interests enough, the enemy companies will take over and finish the job," Frederick concluded. "Quite right," Colin agreed. "To properly defend this time, we need to ensure every city and nation is upgraded with new innovations, weapons, and defenses, because when the attack comes, I want people prepared to repel them forcefully." "There are those who may misuse the technology you're providing," Frederick warned. "True," Colin accepted. "But we know what will happen if we don't take action. If they want humanity to avoid spending the rest of its existence in chains, they'll help us. It's their only chance. This fight will stretch over the entire world and across centuries. And it's only getting started." So quoth this raven. Oh, I thought it was time for another little steampunk, and this time a cyberpunk crossover. I hope you enjoyed it, my darlings. If you did, visit Glenn Koerner and read his other works. A special thank you to my Patreon supporters: Ermin Case, Darren and Jennifer Daw, and Callist Enoch. And to all of you, my darlings, thank you for listening to my little stories. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.